Hello. 1804. Our story picks up. Lewis and Clark for kids. May 14th, 1804, Lewis and Clark enter the Missouri River. Clark had done some preparations of his own while waiting for Lewis. He had interviewed dozens of eager young men who wanted to join the expedition. Clark and Lewis had agreed that they wanted brave and strong young men of good character. Hunting skills were very important. They also looked for men who had experience repairing boats, cooking, or making and repairing weapons. When Lewis arrived, he and Clark chose a few of the many men who had applied. They swore them into the army and into their expedition, the Corps of Discovery. Another new member of the expedition was Clark's slave York. York was the same age as Clark and had lived with him all his life. Soon they were back on the Ohio and rapidly approaching the Mississippi River. At one stop, they met George Drouillard. Sorry, George, I'm sure I just butchered your name. A half-French, half-Shawnee fur trapper and scout. He spoke several Indian languages and was also skillful in the sign language used among the western Indian tribes. He was an excellent hunter and woodsman. Lewis and Clark asked him to join them on their journey and were happy when he said yes. As they continued to travel downriver, they stopped at army posts where other young men lined up for the chance to volunteer for the expedition. Would you have wanted to go on that? Evidently, they reached the junction of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, and when they turned into the current of the mighty Mississippi River, the men learned just how hard it was to travel upstream. The sandbars of the Ohio seemed like nothing compared to the current of this powerful river. Pulling against the oars as hard as they could, they were able to travel only a few miles each day. They stopped at an army fort of Kaskaskia, where several soldiers volunteered to join them. They passed the frontier town of St. Louis and then reached Wood River, which they chose as their site for a winter camp. It was early December. They would go no further until after the spring thaw. The men quickly got to work cutting trees and building huts for their winter quarantine. Not quarantine. For their winter, turn the page, quarters. They named their site Camp Wood. Every day, Clark lined the men up for military drill and shooting practice. Some of them weren't very good. When local settlers dropped by, they held shooting contests with the explorers. The settlers usually won. It was a long winter, and the young men who had signed up hoping for adventure became bored and restless. They got into fights with one another. Some slipped out of the camp and came back drunk. Even though the stay at Wood River was tedious, it was a good way for Lewis and Clark to get to know the men and to choose those who would join them on the journey ahead. They couldn't afford to have any discipline problems on this expedition. They would only bring those men who showed good character, who could take orders and cooperate with others. Lewis and Clark selected 26 men for the Corps of Discovery. These men would make the whole journey and would travel together on the keelboat. Another group of 6 soldiers, headed by Corporal Richard Worthington and paddling a perigue, would accompany the corps up the Missouri River for the first stage of the trip. After the expedition stopped for the second winter, this group would return south in the keelboat with the first batch of specimens and reports for President Jefferson. 8 French-Canadian voyagers would travel along in another perigue and return with Worthington's group. The very best men were chosen for the corps. Each had something special to contribute. Some were especially good woodsmen, Some had experience with boats. Others were blacksmiths or carpenters. Two of the men, Pere Cruzet and Francis Liebisch, were French Indian traders who spoke Indian languages and had already traveled part way up the Missouri River. The rest of the men were glad to have Cruzet and another private, George Gibson, along. They were great fiddlers. All the men were courageous, strong, hardy, and enthusiastic. The weather had begun to warm. Snow melted and ice crackled, and young men grew impatient to be on their way. Clark oversaw their work as they packed barrels and crates onto the boats. They were fixin' for a start, Clark wrote in his journal. Lewis went to St. Louis for last-minute errands and to send President Jefferson a package containing tree cuttings and a horned toad. Catch one of those. Finally, one gentle spring day in mid-May, they finished packing the Discovery and the expedition was ready to begin. The men pulled out their oars and crossed the Mississippi River, then entered the mouth of the Missouri River. In 2 days of hard rowing, they went a short distance to the village of St. Charles. Lewis traveled from St. Louis on horseback and joined the boats there. This is a picture called The Discovery of St. Charles. So you can see what their keelboat looked like. May 21st, 1804. The corpse of Discovery leaves St. Charles and embarks on its journey. St. Charles, a rustic village of 500 people, was the last white settlement that the corpse would see for a very long time. In the morning before they left, the men attended church. In the afternoon, they were ready to set off. The villagers lined up along the bank and gave 3 cheers as the boats pulled away. On May 21st, 1804, the men turned their backs on the world they knew and set their faces toward the west. Ahead lay adventure in an unknown land. In high spirits, the men pulled out their oars against the Missouri River's strong current and began their long journey.